It's only a matter of time until a woman gets terribly injured or possibly even killed in a sport because, governing bodies are too afraid to say that men shouldn't be competing against them. And I'm worried it's only a matter of time before, again, we see something horrific taking place in a safe space that should be for women only. And, the big thing I talk about is the irreversible harm being caused to children from experimental medication and surgery. So, the impact is immeasurable.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, I sit down with James Esses, a therapist and child counsellor who says gender ideology is the biggest issue of our time. James was expelled from his university therapy course after 3 years for launching a petition calling for safeguarding of vulnerable children with gender dysphoria.
It's not uncommon for anyone, but particularly children going through adolescence, to be uncomfortable in their bodies and dislike parts of themselves. But the answer ideally is to get people to be comfortable with who they are rather than trying to fundamentally change themselves. We're literally removing completely healthy parts of young people's bodies that they can never get back again.
He volunteered for several years at Childline, the UK's best-known child support service, and is concerned about the charity's safeguarding.
I spoke to senior management. I discovered that Stonewall had a hand in developing Childline's web materials about transitioning. Because Childline's webpage on gender identity basically, as far as I'm concerned, reads as a roadmap towards the different ways in which a child can transition.
I'm Lee Hall. This is British Thought Leaders. James Esses, thank you for joining us on British Thought Leaders.
Pleasure, thanks for having me.
So you said the issue of gender ideology is the biggest issue of our time. There's obviously some pretty big things going on in the world at the moment. Why is this such a big issue and what impact is it having?
Well, it's universal for a start. All around the world, particularly in the Western world, people are up in arms about the hold that this ideology has taken on all parts of people's lives. And I've said it's the issue of the time, and some people might say that that's, a bit overdramatic. But actually, I would submit that there's not a single person who isn't impacted in some way by this, one way or another. And, I'm sure we'll go on to talk about the people directly impacted, children, women, etc. But even this month, it's Pride Month, and as members of the public going about our day-to-day lives, we can't seem to walk down the street without being bombarded with what I'm saying is ideologically based information. And so it seems as if our corporations, even our government, are no longer non-partisan in that respect.
I know a lot of people contact you and with various issues. Could you give us some idea of the kind of scale and seriousness of the problem?
Well, and the problem is there's not great statistics in this area, but there's been a significant uplift in children saying that they are trapped in the wrong body. We saw dramatic increases in children and young people presenting to the Tavistock Clinic, wanting to medically transition. But even in terms of surveys, even in terms of data from the last national census, it seems that more and more people, particularly younger people, are saying that they're trans. So we've got that. We're hearing stories time and time again of people being cancelled from education, from their jobs, because they dare to say that they believe that men can't become women and vice versa. We're hearing stories of women's spaces being encroached upon. Everyone knows the Isla Bryson case in Scotland recently. We're having male rapists being housed in female prisons. So the numbers are definitely there. And I'm concerned that if this goes on, we're going to see serious negative repercussions. As far as I'm concerned, it's only a matter of time until a woman gets terribly injured or possibly even killed in a sport because, governing bodies are too afraid to say that men shouldn't be competing against them. And I'm worried it's only a matter of time before, again, we see something horrific taking place in a safe space that should be for women only. And, the big thing I talk about is the irreversible harm being caused to children from experimental medication and surgery. So, the impact is immeasurable.
If a child goes to the doctor, say they've got symptoms of anorexia, something like that, the doctor wouldn't say to them, oh yeah, you're too fat, let's go for liposuction. But if a child goes to the doctor and says, oh, I'm in the wrong body, See that the doctor kind of affirms that and is quite quick to move towards medical intervention. Why is there such a different approach?
I've been racking my brain with that, and the problem is we've lost sight of what this presentation is, because I will always start from the position that it is a mental health condition, and so it should be treated as we treat all mental health conditions, usually through explorative therapy, sometimes through types of medication. But the message we're constantly being bombarded with is that this isn't a mental health condition, it's just an identity. Everyone's got a gender identity. There's nothing to pathologise. And I think that message is unfortunately seeping down now into the medical professions, into the therapeutic professions. So if somebody's saying, I'm trapped in the wrong body, it's not a case anymore of you've got a mental health condition, how can we help you to become comfortable with your body? It's, what do you want to change about yourself? And as you've alluded to, it's completely out of line with how we treat other conditions.
I mean, the child goes to the doctor and they're told that gender is something you can choose now. You can now choose a new identity. It's also kind of affirmed at school and things like that. But I mean, children have always pretended to be someone else, like you're a superhero or whatever. But adults always had the role of kind of bringing them down to earth. Like, don't jump out the window, you're not a superhero, really. You're just kind of playing. Now we've got the responsible adults indulging and encouraging this fantasy identity. What do you think the effect on mental health of these children is going to be?
Well, you're completely right. I mean, children, and particularly adolescents, particularly going through puberty, has been a time for exploration and even rebellion. And we can think of many fads and cultures that existed over time, even just things like goth or emo culture, in which parents would find their kids coming home one day looking completely different, wearing God knows what, and listening to all sorts of mad music and all the rest of it. But the point was, number one, a phase that usually by the time people reached young adulthood would have grown out of, and number two, wasn't going to actually cause any long-lasting damage to them mentally or physically. This seems to be the kind of new craze or fad at our time. The studies that show that young people, for example, who are coming out as trans will often know multiple other young people who are coming out as trans at the same time. We hear anecdotal stories of whole cohorts of girls in all girls' schools coming out as trans within the short period of each other. I've often said that there's a kind of contagion element about this, particularly in the way that we've seen a complete inverse in who it's affecting. I mean, historically, it was men wanting to become women, and now the highest proportion in society is coming from young adolescent girls. Right. You're right, they're giving the wrong messages, and sometimes it's outside of parents' control. I'll often have parents contact me who are absolutely terrified because of what their children are being taught at school, where they're not able to monitor it. And often they have a real difficult time of even getting hold of the materials that children are being taught at schools. So there's a lot of adults who have a big role in what is being done to children.
There's also these third-party providers. I had several guests on the show talk about them, who are playing quite a considerable role in providing materials to the school, affecting what the children are being taught. Could you talk to us a bit about those?
I mean, so much of these materials are coming from these kind of quote-unquote charities, these LGBT educational trusts. And, on the face of it, they would say that they're teaching about inclusion and diversity, and that's all very vague and ambiguous and sounds lovely and positive, but actually when you drill down at the materials, it's quite concerning. I've come across materials, kind of cartoon-style books for primary school students, telling them that the doctor took a guess at their sex when they were born and might have made a mistake. I've seen materials with highly regressive material within it, suggesting to young boys that liking the colour pink could be symptomatic of being trans. And it's bizarre because I thought we were actually moving away from stereotypes as a liberal society, but it seems that we're right back in the thick of it again. I see gender ideology being snuck in behind the back door in modules where it's highly irrelevant. I mean, I've seen this in computing and maths lesson plans. Somehow they managed to get the concept of binary versus non-binary gender into a computer coding class, which is, I mean, it's crazy, but it's happening.
Moving on from the mental side, what about the physical side? What changes are some of these children going through if they do go forward?
Well, we're forever being told that puberty blockers are reversible. I was on a Twitter conversation the other day, and someone in America said puberty blockers are 99.9% reversible, and that is utter nonsense because studies show that they have an impact on brain development and bone growth. Of course, there's untold social effects. I mean, there's nothing natural about disrupting somebody's puberty. And so even if, a child can come off that at a later point and start puberty, a 14, 15-year-old who commences puberty a number of years after their peers, that isn't natural. Cross-sex hormones can have irreversible physical impacts, and it can range from what some might think is kind of relatively benign, which is things like vocal changes, hair growth. But one of the most concerning things is if a child starts puberty blockers before commencing puberty and then goes on to take cross-sex hormones straight after that, they can be left permanently infertile. There's studies showing links to increased risk of things like heart problems, particularly in young girls taking testosterone. And then with the surgical procedures, well, I mean, that's pretty clear to see. I mean, we're literally removing completely healthy parts of young people's bodies that they can never get back again. And again, some of the rhetoric on the other side I find sickening. I've read online trans activists saying it doesn't matter if a young woman has a double mastectomy because at a later point, if she regrets it, she can always get breast implants put back in. I mean, it's sick, it's ludicrous.
It's almost like some kind of transhuman thing there. Like you're saying, well, you can just have bits of you chopped off, you can replace them with artificial bits later on. How do we get to this point where people are saying things like that?
I don't know. It's got a cult-like feel about it, actually, and often a lot of false rhetoric, like puberty blockers are reversible. A lot of alienation as well. Mermaids, for example, when I was reading their materials, listening to their podcast, the message often is if your parents aren't on board with this, if they're not willing to call you by the pronouns that you want, etc., family isn't blood. You've got a community here. Come and join us, and that's quite concerning. As I say, children are being pumped with this messaging in schools, and then they go home. And I've recently discovered some horrific safeguarding issues with Childline, for example. So, God knows what children are seeing on other websites that aren't national beloved charities. I mean, social media has a big role to play in this as well. So there's this constant bombarding of messaging, even a kind of pressure, I suppose, into transitioning because, again, mermaids I've listened to a podcast where they tell people that if they come out as trans, they can, quote, make the world a better place. That's very coercive, particularly to a young child, possibly in the midst of puberty, possibly feeling insecure and uncertain about themselves. And all of a sudden they can just come out and say, I'm in the wrong body. And all of a sudden they're making the world a better place. I mean, you can see the appeal to it for a young child.
So you were previously a barrister and you worked in the civil service, and then you kind of left that world to become a child therapist. And then partway through your course, you were expelled from the course. Can you tell us what happened?
Yeah, I was 3 years into my course, and before I started the course, the gender ideology wasn't on my radar. I just wanted to help people for whatever mental health issues they were struggling with. I'd been counselling at Childline for a few years. That was what got me down the path of wanting to do this as a vocation for the rest of my life. And then partway through the course, I began to take note of what was going on in society. I was beginning to hear some of the horror stories with the impact that this was having on children. I read up some books on it. I considered the therapeutic and legal position of it, and I basically came to the conclusion that I had to say something about it because it did not sit right with me ethically. As a trainee therapist, it didn't sit right with me. And I thought of all vocations, the one that will be willing to have a conversation about complex, sensitive issues is therapy, because it's meant to be based around empathy and active listening. So I joined together with a group of other therapists and trainees. We're now a group called Thoughtful Therapists, basically sharing similar concerns in this space. Decided to write a petition to the government because at that time they had announced that they were going to ban conversion therapy. And there's a real concern that this was going to have a chilling impact on the profession, basically forcing therapists to affirm people into transitioning. So I started this government petition and it had my name on it, and I did some publicity around it. And then I received an email in May of 21 from the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of my institute, who I've never had any previous dealings with before, saying that there's been some complaints made about my petition. Would I come in for a chat? And she called it an informal chat. Now, at that point, I felt a bit anxious, but I tried to trust in what she was saying. So I said, yes, of course I will. Let's chat again. And so we set up a meeting for 2 days later. The very next day, I received another email, less than 24 hours after the first one, and the subject line said termination of contract. And I was informed that I was being expelled with immediate effect, that there would be no informal chat, there would be no hearing, there would be no appeal. And when I went to respond to the email, they'd already blocked my university email address, so I couldn't even communicate with them. So basically, in a single email, my entire life's ambitions went up in smoke.
What kind of pressure must have been on them to do that? 'Cause, they didn't even wait until the meeting.
Well, unfortunately, and I'm still in the early days of litigation, which we'll get onto, but I don't have all the evidence. But I submitted a subject access request for my personal data, so I've seen some of what was going on in the background. I saw that there were some complaints, although I haven't really seen the nature of them. I know there were a lot of internal discussions about kind of what to do. Pressure, I don't know. I hadn't said anything that controversial.
So you were just calling for some attention to be paid to something that you thought wasn't quite right, basically.
Yeah, and I believe that that legislation for banning conversion therapy was misguided, and I wrote an article that I published about this. But I made a point of saying that conversion therapy, in terms of what people think of, kind of, some of the abhorrent things we've seen over the years to try and change people's sexuality, things like corrective rape and electric shock treatment. I made a point of saying I thought all of that was, of course, absolutely abhorrent, but that this was not the answer, and this was going to end up basically criminalising explorative therapists who have concerns about their clients. So I didn't think that was that controversial, but supposedly it was enough to bring them, and they said the entire profession, into disrepute.
So you're now embarking on litigation with this?
Yeah, well, having practiced as a lawyer myself before, I didn't particularly want to get involved in litigation because I know it's expensive and time-consuming, but I didn't really have a choice, to be honest. I mean, as I said, they breached all their own policies. They weren't willing to have any conversation with me. They kind of threw the rule book out the window. So as far as I was concerned, I was left with no choice. I instructed a legal team. They thought and still think that I've got a strong case. It's based on discrimination against my beliefs, gender-critical beliefs, as they're known. So I'm now on that path. I mean, it's taken a long time, and there's been a lot of delay, and it might not get to trial for another year or two, potentially, which is very frustrating. But I have to do it, for my own sense of justice.
So in terms of the therapy community, have you found there are a lot of therapists that agree with you, but they want to keep quiet, or do you think the community has largely been captured by this ideology?
It's a mix.
Okay.
I have a lot of therapists who reach out to me anonymously and say that they support what I'm saying, but they're too afraid to speak out because there's been others who have been hauled in front of disciplinary committees, etc., simply for stating things like, men are men and women are women on Twitter. But there's a lot of hostility as well. I would say this is a vocation that has been ideologically captured in that respect. I was asked to give a talk at a therapeutic conference last September, I think it was, and the controversy that my attendance generated was crazy. People tried to have it cancelled. These are other therapists tried to have it cancelled. Then when they wouldn't cancel me, they basically boycotted the event itself. Directly after I was speaking, they felt the need to set up a safe space to talk about trans people, where they could support each other in a nurturing environment. I mean, it was crazy. And again, what I was saying, number one, is not that controversial. I'm basically saying we shouldn't cause irreversible harm to children. And by the way, maybe we should protect women's rights as well. And also, I always try and have a respectful dialogue. And I would have a dialogue with anyone, including those that kind of, seriously oppose what I'm saying. I'd have a respectful dialogue because that's how we work together as a society. But the people who are opposed to my beliefs in this space aren't willing to offer the same in return. It's particularly worrying again for therapists. Therapists should have a certain degree of resilience. But the fact that they could be so triggered by the mere fact I was present in a building with them, I think says a lot. And I do worry about those therapists, and I particularly worry for the clients that they're seeing and the harm they might be causing to those clients.
You mentioned about Childline. You were doing some work for Childline, and then you had some concerns about that. What was it that alarmed you about the Childline?
Well, I mean, it was actually children coming through talking to me when I was doing my counselling there, saying that they were trans, that got me involved in all of this in the first place, and started raising red flags. But I was concerned about what was taking place within the organisation as well. I would see counsellors, requesting children's pronouns at the very start of the conversation or offering their pronouns back to them. I mean, sometimes these are children in the middle of a crisis, possibly actively in the middle of trying to kill themselves. Right. And counsellors are more concerned with bloody pronouns. I mean, pathetic. I would come into shifts and I'd see posters from Stonewall, all over the wall. And again, as far as I was concerned, when I signed up to this was meant to be a neutral, non-partisan group. And instead, they're promoting Stonewall. And I did a bit of digging. I spoke to senior management. I discovered that Stonewall had had a hand in developing Childline's web materials about transitioning. Because Childline's webpage on gender identity, basically, as far as I'm concerned, reads as a roadmap towards the different ways in which a child can transition. Again, that seemed highly, highly inappropriate. So I raised concerns with senior management. I offered to help redraft the website. I wanted to collaborate with them on this and try and make things different from the inside. And for a time, it seemed as if they were willing to work with me on this. But really, they were just pandering and kind of pretending that they were going along with what I was proposing. And then I was asked onto a Zoom call by the head of Childline, and he told me in the first sentence that I wasn't to come in for my next shift. And that was the end of it. I wouldn't be volunteering there anymore. And that was after 5 years of offering weekly counselling on their behalf. So, that was, it was shocking. It's still shocking. In some ways it hurts more than being kicked off the course. And I often have to walk by the Childline building and I feel deeply sad that I'm not able to be in there offering that same counselling to young people. But since they kicked me out, things seem to have gone from worse to worse, and I've come across now message boards on Childline in which children are encouraging other where to source breast binders or telling each other that there's a genocide taking place against them and there's no moderation by Childline staff or any red flags being raised at all. And they don't really seem to give a damn. I've complained to the Charity Commission. They've said they're now looking into this to see whether they might investigate. But Childline themselves seem to stand by what they've done. I've reached out to the Chief Executive Officer with my list of complaints and issues. He's not had the time to respond, although I noticed the other day he's had plenty of time to post about cricket on Twitter. So I'm concerned about what his priorities are at this moment in time. But I mean, look, if children and adults can't trust Childline and the NSPCC, where can they trust?
Yeah. So there must be other people at Childline who have similar concerns to you. It's hard to imagine that you're the only one. Do you think they're just kind of going along with it, or?
I mean, I've had people reach out to me again from Childline, but always anonymously. Right. Because they don't want to lose their jobs. Right. They don't want the same thing that happened to me to happen to them. So it's a shame, it's frustrating, because I feel that we need more people to be able to put their head above the parapet in order to make a difference. But at the same time, I appreciate that people have got responsibilities and they might have children and mortgages, so they can't risk losing their jobs. I think a lot of people just want an easy life, to be honest. And some just want to appear virtuous. You know? As I said, this is a bit of a fad at the moment. You know, putting your, even if you are cis, i.e. not trans, if we're going to use that term, you know, cis, people putting their pronouns at the end of their email signature. I mean, what is that? Other than virtue signalling and sending a message, look at me, I'm a great ally to the trans cause. So I don't know. I wish more people would speak out about it, really. Again, particularly children's counsellors. I just find it crazy that we're medicalising children for a mental health condition. You know, gender dysphoria, things like body dysmorphia. You mentioned anorexia earlier. You know, it's not uncommon for anyone, but particularly children going through adolescence, to be uncomfortable in their bodies and dislike parts of themselves. But the answer ideally is to get people to be comfortable with who they are rather than trying to fundamentally change themselves. I thought that was kind of psychology 101. Not anymore.
You know, we've always, British society generally, have this feeling that the person in the suit, you can trust them, the institution, you can trust them to be doing the right thing. We don't need to worry too much about what Childline, for example, is doing because they're a solid British institution. And the same with teachers. You assume, you know, that they're teaching your children the 3 R's, not some extreme gender ideology. Do you think this issue, this gender issue, is causing a bit of a turning point and people are starting to question all these institutions they always trusted?
Yeah. I have parents emailing me and they don't know who to trust anymore. And they feel like they can't trust the doctors or the therapists or the teachers or the companies or the politicians. You know, I did a bit of cursory research the other day and I found that of all the mainstream political parties in the UK, there's only one party whose leader does not believe that women can have a penis. And that's Rishi Sunak. And, you know, the Conservative Party have not been great on this issue, but they're the only ones. You know, so I and many others are very fearful about what's going to happen at the next election. And I'm in the process of trying to create a bit of an alliance to try and basically elicit some pledges from some politicians. Otherwise, they're going to face the consequences of the ballot box. But yeah, who can we trust? And even if people, you know, hold stead of their professional ethics and duties, there's unfortunately now ways around it. People play the system. So, for example, stuff has come out recently to do with mermaids and the Tavistock. Susie Green, the former CEO of Mermaids, basically having a direct line to the head of the Tavistock and making referrals to children, from children to the Tavistock, even though that she's not a mental or medical professional. And she sees no issue with it. She posted something on Twitter the other day saying, what's the issue if I was doing the referrals if children's transphobic doctors wouldn't do them themselves? So she's putting out this narrative that if a doctor doesn't believe that a child should be on puberty blockers, it can't be because they don't believe it's in the best interest of that child. It must be because they're transphobic. So this is the issue. Even those who try and do the right thing end up, you know, becoming unstuck. And that's why I'm concerned about this conversion therapy legislation that the government are still saying they're going to be bringing in, because I fear the therapists are going to be accused of being conversion therapists simply because they don't nod along when a young person says, I want to start cross-sex hormones and have my breasts chopped off.
In parts of North America, some of the therapists are worried about not going along with the gender-affirming care in case they lose their license. Do you think that's something that we could reach that point here?
Yeah, I do. And I more and more therapists speak to me, say they just won't bother seeing clients with gender dysphoria because it will be too risky for them. They don't want to lose their license. They don't want to potentially be criminalised. I mean, we have yet to see what the draft wording of this conversion therapy bill is, but it could well be a criminal offence that means that people who are convicted of it, receive jail time. So yes, you'll have clinicians not wanting to work in this space anymore. And it's a very difficult area to legislate for as well, because we can't even define things like man or woman in today's society. So how can you create proper legislation in this space? And And it's a real slippery slope as well. I talk about in Australia, in Victoria, Australia, they passed a conversion therapy ban a year or two ago. And their Equality and Human Rights Commission have come out and said that parents who don't allow their children to take puberty blockers might be guilty of committing an offence of conversion therapy. So we could end up criminalising concerned parents as well off the back of this legislation. So yes, I mean, the threat is real. Therapists are already kind of captured. There's a document called the Memorandum of Understanding on Conversion Therapy, and basically if you're signed up to any of the main regulatory bodies in the UK, you have to go along with it, and it basically promotes an affirmation-only approach. So it's not good for professional independence and ethics. As far as I'm concerned, it flies in the face of the Hippocratic Oath.
We've seen this gender ideology throughout society, in the corporations, institutions, etc. One area that seems to be standing up slightly more than others is sport. I know British Cycling recently brought in some policy changes. Could you talk to us a bit about that?
Yeah, we've seen a bit of a pushback in the sport sector, particularly in the UK, but some other international bodies as well. And you've had a lot of former and current athletes, particularly people like Sharon Davies, standing out and saying this isn't okay. And I think it's something that's kind of unified a lot of society in a way. It's something that everyone can get their heads around, talking about things like mental health conditions and hormones. I think for some people it goes over their heads, or it may appear a bit too complex, but, everyone knows about sport and everyone understands this idea of kind of basic human fairness. And so it's obvious, I think, to the public at large that you shouldn't have men who've had the benefit of going through a male puberty and have all the natural physiological advantages that men have competing against women. So, it's very good to see this, although, again, even British Cycling is holding back from embracing reality completely. They've said they're not going to allow men to compete against women in professional cycling, but they've said that for community-based cycling initiatives that they run, that they're still going to allow it to take place, including in women-only community-based cycling events, which is bizarre, because if it's women-only, it should be women-only. But they're saying men can continue to take part in that, and they're still using a lot of ideological language. They're using phrases like sex assigned at birth, which is usually an ideological giveaway. So I think a lot of these bodies, whilst they're to be commended for protecting professional sport, they're trying to placate everyone and back both horses, and that's not in the interests of reality as a society. I'm looking forward to the day in which organisations stand up and say, actually, you know what, men can't become women, and we're not ashamed or afraid to say that. But for the time being, we've kind of got this halfway house. But it's certainly better than it was even a few months ago. Things are definitely going in the right direction.
What if, say, you could have several big changes in society to try and deal with this? What would they be?
Well, I think we need to get clarification in our legislation, and there's current proposals from the government about potentially amending the Equality Act to make it clear that when they use the word sex, that it means biological sex. So I think that's very important. I would have a complete ban on irreversible medical transitioning for children. I need to give some more thought to the position for adults. Generally, I'm of the opinion that consenting adults should be free to do what they want as long as they're not harming anybody else. But I still don't believe it's therapeutically ethical to do this. So I need to give that more thought. But certainly, I would have it banned for children completely. Any form of transitioning in that respect. I think women's spaces need to be protected. There should be no circumstances in which biological men are able to enter spaces like female prisons or female domestic abuse shelters or what have you. And we need free speech to be properly protected. I'm still concerned. The government have released new guidance on these non-crime hate incidents, but there's still people who are losing their jobs and their livelihoods and reputations because, they dare to say that men can't become women, or because they use the wrong pronouns for somebody, and that should not be happening in this society. And And we need to see universities and places of study uphold free speech, for their students. Even what we saw the other day in Oxford, with Kathleen Stock going to speak there. And I'm very happy that the event went ahead. But I mean, these students, they're not there to protest. They're there to shut down and disrupt. And it's concerning that it is what's meant to be a beacon of intellect and academia, that there are students there willing to shut down free and open debate. Those universities should be thinking about the type of students that they want on their campus. So a lot of changes and more. I wouldn't be bringing forward this conversion therapy bill. I certainly would never be bringing forward any form of self-ID. And we're waiting to see the outcome of the legal battle between Scotland and the wider UK government, because the First Minister of Scotland has said that he's challenging the UK government's block on their gender recognition bill. So I have to wait and see what the outcome of that is. But if people are simply able to self-identify as whatever sex they want, then that could have serious repercussions for this country. I feel a bit politically homeless at the moment, as I know many others do. And I'm longing for a political party that I can truly trust on this issue. At this moment in time, it's certainly the Conservatives out of all the others, but there's a hell of a lot more that we need them to do if we're really going to actually see a positive shift.
Where can people go if they want to find out more?
If people want to keep up with my work, I'm on Twitter. I've got a Substack as well. People can keep up to date with my case. I've got a crowd justice page. I have to keep raising funds because, as I said, this is extremely expensive, and I'm hugely thankful to those who have donated to the cause so far, because without that I simply wouldn't have been able to bring this case in the first place. So people can get updates on my case and donate if they like to on that page. And to be honest, and I'm very thankful I can say this, but reading most mainstream papers most days of the week, I mean, the Telegraph, the Mail, to some extent the Times, have been very good at covering this over recent months, and there isn't a day that goes by without this stuff cropping up in the news. So people are finally talking about this. And I would encourage those listening, if they feel able to stand up and speak out, because unless a greater cohort of society are willing to actually stand up for what they believe in, things just aren't going to change.
James Esses, thank you for joining us on British Thought Leaders.
Thank you.